What's going on YouTube? WestHobbiesRC. So today we are back with the Turbine Build project. Super excited for this helicopter. So what are we building? We are building a SAB Raw 700 Nitro, and we are putting the Sukhoi 45 turbine in it. I know some of you guys wanted to scale, but that project may still be coming as well. But for now, we got a turbine Raw 700. So of course, the first thing we have here is our Sukhoi X45, and then we are running a V-Bar Evo, Theta servos. We have C1 on cyclic, so 3 of them, and a T1 on tail. We are running the SAB servo horns and torque servo grommets. So let's go ahead and hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and let's get this build started. We got the servos and transmission assembly onto the upper frame sides here. So again, we got the Theta servos, SAB horns, torque grommets on there. So now we are going to move on to building the head, get the head assembly swash plate done, and then we'll start moving on to the engine mount and mocking up the turbine and getting that mounted. We are building the head now, and I just wanted to point something out to remember. We got everything micro lubed up. We got all of our screws cleaned off here with rubbing alcohol. When you assemble your thrust bearings, remember there is a inside and a outside diameter thrust bearing. The larger ID is your inside, so towards the head block itself. The smaller ID goes towards the outside of the blade grip or the outside of the feathering shaft, but it is very important to assemble these bearings, larger and smaller ID, the correct direction. And always remember that the open side that we pack full of grease here, that goes towards the inside with this shim. So it's gonna be smaller ID, thrust bearing, open side of the thrust bearing, larger ID, then the shim against the inside the blade grip, and then you slide the whole blade grip into place and make sure you clean all of your screws. Got the head completely assembled, swash plate on, linkages going from the servos to the swash plate. A little tip for you guys, when you are doing these linkages here, if you put the threaded rod in a drill motor and you pre-drill your threads into your linkages, it'll make assembling them so much easier. It will also make adjusting them so much easier. Same with the linkages going from the swash plate to the head if you thread those in. But remember, this is right hand, this is left hand. The side farther away from the hole is left-handed threads, side closer to the hole, right-handed threads. So we have all that done. We also have our tensioner assembly inside of the frame here. Our tensioner is pre-tensioned on the spring. So now we are going to move on to setting this aside and doing the lower frame halves and the skids. We are getting the lower frame sides ready for the stickers and for these little double-sided decal stickers that hold these little spacers on. Just remember, a little bit of rubbing alcohol, paper towel, and just clean all of your carbon fiber prior to putting any kind of decal on, because you can see carbon fiber is dusty and it will not allow it to stick properly, and you can run the risk of it popping back off in the future. And we have it sitting on its skids. So we got the lower frame sides down, skids are mounted, we got the front supports going out. So now it is time to get the engine mount assembled and start mocking up the turbine and seeing how it all fits inside of here. So let's get the engine mount assembled. We have our clutch fan installed to the clutch and then our clutch bell. Remember when installing this stuff that you tighten everything. So you start with your clutch itself, tighten these 2 screws very evenly so everything sits down perfectly. And then when you're doing your clutch fan, make sure that you tighten all 4 of these screws evenly so that way nothing gets warped or twisted so you don't have any kinds of vibrations. So now that our clutch assembly is completed, we are going to take our crank lock and we are going to get this slid through here. We're going to tighten this down, use a wrench, and I believe that's a 6mm hex head in the middle to lock this down to here. You don't need to use any Loctite on that right there. And then we're going to get this assembly tightened down to the motor itself. If you want to use a little bit of Loctite on this nut, you can. Just remember when you go to take it back apart that there is Loctite on there. So now, unlike a Nitro model, we don't have a crank lock tool, so there's no way to lock this. So I found if you pull the back cover off, there is a nut on the inside. I believe it is a 11mm. So you're gonna take your clutch stack now. I put a dab of Loctite, just a dab, you don't need much. We're going to thread our clutch assembly on. This side here, you do not need Loctite on these threads here. No Loctite is needed. You just need to get a good tighten down. So you're going to thread this all the way down until it stops. And then we're going to come back on the inside. We're going to hold that nut, and we are going to use our 6mm Allen, and we're going to run this screw down until it is tight. And make sure that is tight. Whenever you get that tight, you can come in and put your pinch bolts in. Also remember, make sure there's a washer there. And we got the engine mounted to the engine mount. We got the clutch stack all tightened down, belt on. These screws were not fun at all to get in. There is no room here. And 3mm, it was a pain, but slowly worked them all together and got them all tightened up. So now we can mock the engine up in the frame, because then we're going to have to come back with our fan shroud and trim it and cut it so it fits around here. But first, let's just get it mocked in the frame and see what it looks like. Engine is mocked up in the helicopter. So the turbine is in place. We still have to put the fan shroud, even though this is a turbine. You don't need the fan shroud or the fan. We're just going to put it on anyways to help cover this section here, give us some areas to mount the fuel pump and our switches and all that kind of stuff. We need to tension the belt, but again, it's just sitting in place. So a couple things we're going to need to do is we're going to need to notch the carbon reel. On this side, it clears. On this side, it does not. So the exhaust pipe is touching. So we're going to notch both of those. We still need to put the magnets in the fan for the governor. So we need to get the magnets put in there. And I know a lot of you are going to say it looks really funny because it is sticking out so far. But remember, the canopy covers most of this. So we're going to build a custom carbon fiber bottom hatch to help hide all of this. So let's get the engine pulled back out. Let's notch these frame sides and let's get the magnets glued into the fan. We got the engine pulled back out and we have our front side plates off of it. Now we have some of this Star Bond. This is awesome CA and kicker. I use this a lot for gluing this stuff together. I have the backside covered in painter's tape. We're going to put a dab of CA across and we're going to glue these two halves together. And the reason for that, as you can see these two marks that I made here, we need to notch the front side frames for the exhaust to clear. As it comes out, it's touching. So we're going to glue these together, clamp them, and then when we notch them, it'll notch both of them the same way. Then we can peel all of our tape off and no glue stuck to anything. So let's get those notched. Now we got it sanded, used a drum sander on our Dremel. Just be careful when cutting or sanding carbon fiber as it is toxic. So now we can peel these two halves apart. We can get them screwed back onto our frame here and move on to fitting the clutch fan cover onto the engine. Those front plates are back on. Everything is sanded. They came out looking good. So now it is time to set this assembly aside for a second, and we're going to grab our engine. And we need to do two things before we can put the engine back in for the final time. We need to epoxy our magnets for the RPM sensor. So you can see here, I marked them with black Sharpie, and that's going to be the side that goes up. You can wave your magnets in front of your sensor to see which side is which, and those will get epoxied in right there and on the other side right there. So we got to get those glued in. And then we have to take our fan shroud here, and we're going to have to cut this. So as you can see, it doesn't fit. Our shroud has to be modified to fit around the turbine housing itself. So we are going to mock that into place. We are going to come down here. We're going to have to trim probably right at the A here. And I want it to be a nice bevel cut up so it kind of follows the curve of the exhaust. And then you also, when running an RPM sensor, you have to cut into here a little bit when you put your bracket on for the sensor to bolt on. So let me get these epoxied in, let it dry overnight, and I'm going to start mocking up and trimming the fan shroud. So I got some 30-minute epoxy mixed up on a bag. I got the fan taped off on the bottom so it can't drip through. And I got my magnets on a little piece of painter's tape. The black side Sharpie is stuck to the tape. We know it's going to go in this way. Just going to take some of that 30-minute epoxy and push it into that hole right there. Get our magnets glued into place. Let them fully cure. And then we can start cutting that shroud. So I got the fan shroud marked off. So I'm going to rough cut it a little lower than this on the bandsaw. And then come back and use a Dremel to help bevel it and round the edges so that way it can fit around the turbine and look nice and clean. So I'm gonna go ahead and get that cut off. Our epoxy, or our magnets are epoxied in place and dry now. So once I get this cut and trimmed, we can mount the RPM sensor, get the shroud on it, and get the engine back in the airframe. Fan shroud is sanded and cut the shape now. So we cut off a couple inches off the bottom, sanded our shape into it to match the engine. I just took a piece of dowel, a big dowel that I had, cut it off, put 220 grit on this side, 120 grit on this side, and that allowed me to sand and rough out my shape, and then final sand with 220. So now let's get the fan shroud on the engine and see how it looks. And we got the shroud on. We got it all cut and fit. It came out perfect. We got a nice gap all the way around it, so I am happy with that. And we also got the X-Guard RPM sensor mounted. So with the sensor, you have to notch the fan shroud if you're going to use a magnet pickup sensor. So you notch the shroud, it goes in there. I'm going to cut a new plate on the CNC, a new carbon plate with elongated holes, so we have more movability and tunability. But now we can stick the engine back in, Loctite it all in, and see how it looks with the shroud on it. And the engine is final mounted. I think it came out great. That fan shroud cutting came out perfect. We notched the lower frame side so that way the exhaust clears perfectly. So now we need to do something about the front of the turbine because this is a lot of weight hanging off this engine mount here. So we had this machined. So this is an aluminum mount. I painted it black. It's going to clamp around our turbine and it is going to mount to 2 holes in the frame side. We're going to drill out our countersink, however we got to do it, and mount this way. It is notched just like this to flow with it. So I believe it goes this way, but I'm going to get this mounted out and then the mounting system is completed and we can move on to the tail boom. Got the front mount clamped onto the turbine, but I have to wait till I get a 2.5 millimeter tap because the hole that was tapped was too far down. So I need to drill right in the middle, tap a 2.5 millimeter thread, and I have to repaint it because I scratched it all up. But we're gonna set this whole assembly aside now and start on the tail boom. Tail is completed, all assembled Loctite, and the boom is sitting on the helicopter. We still have to tension the belt and mount the tail servo. So now I'm gonna get the tail servo mounted, tension the belt, and then we can move on to doing the fuel system and wait on the UAT tank that has to go in the back to get here. I got the fuel tank built and it's just sitting there. It's not bolted in or anything because I'm trying to figure out the fuel system. So one thing we were waiting on, which just came in the mail, was a UAT tank. So we got our tank. It was modified by Mario. So Mario, I greatly appreciate the modification of the UAT tank because I don't want this to be ugly. I don't want a tank hanging out the side or bolted here. I want it to be nice and clean. So we already know that our fuel pump is going to go there. So the UAT tank, the only spot for it to make it still look good is going to be in this area right here. We also got a tail servo installed. So our UAT tank is going to fit right into here, just like this. And we have these flat mounts, but we need to come up with a mount for going into side to side here. So we're going to come up with a mount, get this mounted into here, and then we can start running our fuel lines, figuring out how we want to route everything. We got to get the fuel pump in, we got to run our valves, we got to run a bleed line. So let's figure this out and make some kind of brackets. So here is what we came up with. 3D printed out of PETG, I believe. And these are going to get mounted to here, just like this, with a M3 screw right through them. And we're gonna do one here and one here. And then these will drill 2 new holes in the frame side. These will get right into the frame and they should fit just like that. And one will go up there, one will go down here, and our UAT tank will go right there, but of course, and further. So I'm gonna get some screws. I'm going to tap these mounts so that they're threaded, get our screws, mount the UAT tank to that, and then figure out where we need to drill holes, get that mounted, and then we can start running fuel lines. And the mounts are on. So we're using M3 by 12 millimeter screws, and we have tapped all the way around. So now this is going to slide up into here. I just have to figure out exactly where I want to put it. It would fit right here beautifully, clear everything, give us room for all of our fuel lines. I would like to move it up, but the only problem is that top line is gonna hit the boom. So it's gonna have to go right here somewhere. That will mount into there. and then we can start running all of our fuel lines. It looks good. So I've decided to put the UAT tank right there. I need to have room to get a bunch of lines into here. I would like to move it up and move it in farther, but I just don't have the room between the top and the bottom of the boom. But the UAT tank is nice and tucked in out of the way. I also got the fuel pump mounted. So I drilled, countersunk the holes. Our fuel pump is installed right there. So it is nice and hidden. So now I get to start plumbing everything. So we got to go from the fuel tank to the UAT, our fuel line. I'm going to do a nice little cool line coming out here for filling. Our vent line is going to come up to the top, coil up, and then we got to run a line from the UAT to the fuel pump, and then from the fuel pump to a shut-off valve to the engine. So now we are going to drill 2 more holes for the other 2 screws. We got 2 top, we got to get 2 bottom. Get this regular mounted, start running all of our fuel lines, and get ready to put our fuel shutoff valve somewhere. The fuel shutoff valve mounted. I wanted it out of the way, clean and hidden. So what I did is I drilled 2 holes into the front frame support here, and the valve is tucked underneath. So when it goes back, that's fuel on. You pull it forward, that is fuel off. I used one of these mounts right here. So this is for 4 to 6 millimeter, just a standard ball valve mount. And I cut it, modified it. It took me a while, and I ended up having to notch it and round it so it cleared the engine with a good gap. So now our valve is secured, looks good. Use these little beauty washers to match. So now I'm gonna come out of the mount, or out of the valve, with the fuel filter to our engine here. I still have to repaint this and drill and tap 2 holes. We'll do that. And then out of the fuel pump, our 2 lines, one back to the UAT tank and one going to the valve. So I'm going to start plumbing up that, figuring out the running of wires this way. And I also went ahead and mounted the ECU so I could get an idea of how everything needs to be run. Fuel filter is mounted and our line is ran from the valve. Got a fuel filter, inlet of the engine. So now I am starting to run the line from the fuel pump. So this line is going to come down, around, and into our valve here. And then this line will run all the way back to our UAT tank, and we'll worry about plumbing all of this section up. But I do want to 3D print some clips. So I'm going to go and fire up the printer, get some clips printed so I can hold the lines real nice and clean, one on top and bottom. Get that done, get this ran, and this part of the fuel system will be completed. Got the fuel lines ran from the pump to these 3D printed clips that I made, double-sided taped, and then to a double clip to hold the lines together. And then there's a clip here. So this line is from the pump to the engine. So it runs down, put some canopy protector, and it goes into our valve right here. And then our fuel valve out runs down to our fuel filter and then to our engine. So this whole part of it is done fuel system wise. Now we are running from our fuel pump out, and we have to go from a 4 to a 6 millimeter reducer, which is this guy right here. So this goes from 4 to 6, and then we'll go 6 millimeter to our UAT tank, and then we'll plumb the main tank to the UAT tank and get the UAT vent and fill added on here. But I'm gonna have to end part 1 off here. This has been 3 months so far of a project, making things, waiting for things to be made, fitting things, cutting things. This has been a heck of a project, and I don't want to hold you guys up on watching this video any longer. So we're going to get part 1 out, and then part 2 now will go really quickly because it's just finishing the fuel system, wiring it up, and we are ready for the first start. But you can see what we got going on here. We also need to drill and tap that front mount and get it repainted so it matches, get everything finished, wired up from the computer. We are also going to get another cover, battery cover to go here, so we have 1 light bar on each side. So that's all going to be done in part 2, but hopefully you guys enjoyed part 1. Huge thanks to Mario, I believe. Sorry if I messed your name up, but he's the one that helped us along the way with He Has a Turbine Raw and helped me do a lot of the figuring and making stuff. So huge thanks to him. So I want to give you guys huge thank you for waiting and putting up with this project. I want to thank you so much for watching this channel. If you haven't already, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Remember, Patreon and PayPal are linked in every video description if you'd like to help support me. And Super Thanks is now active on the channel. Take care and have a great day.